Good afternoon and welcome everyone to another Friday seminar brought to you by the Center of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oslo. So thanks everyone for joining. Nice to see you here. So one of the things that we try to do at our center is to keep us updated or share information also about recent publications in the field of Middle Eastern studies that talk to research interests of several of us here at the center. And I think this was one of the aim also behind arranging the talk for today. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Giedrė Šabasevičiūtė, who is a research fellow at the Oriental Institute in the Czech Academy of Science, and she specializes in Egypt's intellectual past and present. Giedrė is also affiliated to CEDEJ, the French Research Center in Cairo, and she's giving this talk from Cairo. So thanks for accepting our invitation, Giedrė. It's a big pleasure for us to have you here. And she has a PhD from the French School of Social Science, right? On the life and work of Sayyid Qutb. So today she will share some insights of this research that she has started several years, and it is in the process of being published in a book. The book is entitled Sayyid Qutb, Sayyid Qutb, an intellectual biography, and it will be published by Syracuse University Press in next month. So it's supposed to come up really soon next month. So it's my big pleasure to welcome you, Giedrė, and thanks again for accepting our invitation. So we will follow the usual format. The talk will last for circa 40-45 minutes, and then we will have some time also for feedback, questions, and answer from the public. So thank you, Giedrė, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Teresa, for introducing me. And thanks University of Oslo for hosting me and giving me this opportunity to share my research. So today I'm going to speak about my research that it's ended, and my research about Sayyid Qutb. And it started 10 years ago as a master's thesis in École des Hautes Études in France. I was a sociology student. Then it led me to PhD, and then finally it's gonna come out as a book. And so basically today I'm gonna speak about the research, how I arrived to do this research and what was my methodology and my findings. So I'm gonna share my screen, because I have some kind of illustration. Okay, so Sayyid Qutb is really a very known figure in Egyptian history, but let me remind some basic general facts for those who maybe do not know him. He was a literary critic, poet, and an essayist writing in the press, who was born in 1906 in Egypt. And in the 50s, he started to advocate the cause of political Islam. He joined the Muslim Brotherhood and was arrested by the Nasser state. He spent 11 years in prison, was liberated and then rearrested, accused of conspiracy against the state, and executed in 1966. So his contemporary legacy as one of the most famous Islamic ideologists is due to the influence his works had on Islamist movements of the 70s and 80s, basically those who came after his death and who ravaged the region at this time. Because of his significance for the Islamist movement, Sayyid Qutb has been studied really a lot. Between the 90s, when he became worldwide famous because of, as a result of internationalization of terrorist acts, and today there is hardly a year passes without a new publication being published on Qutb. So naturally, one might ask why to study him, why there is a need to write something on him, a new biography, and what else can be said and what new can be said about Sayyid Qutb. So I will start by this, because I think this is the natural question that anyone will have. And then I will speak about my methodology and my findings. Okay, so my ambition to reconsider his biography stemmed from the impression that many books existing on his life posed more questions than provided answers. Especially there are two enigmas that I was literally I was particularly attracted to understand. So the first one was his absence in Egypt's literary history, because we know he was a poet and was a literary critic, but there is very little studies and very little talk about his literary life, and also he's very much absent in general histories of literature of the interwar and early post-colonial period. The majority of narratives about Qutb are enclosed within a particular archive, which is the archive of Islamists. And Qutb was mostly studied in the relation to Islamist movement, to the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Islamist thought, with a particular attention to this mystery of his transition from literature to Islam during the 50s. Basically, scholars asked, how come a poet and a literary critic who dedicated his first 40 years to literary career decided to commit himself to Islam, and at that particular point when the Egyptian revolution of 1922 seemed to bring about the much anticipated independence and decolonization. So while this question, of course, it's valid, but I had an impression that in trying to respond to this question, scholars never took seriously his literary past. Of course, scholars covered this period of his youth, mentioned his books, evoked his relations to other writers, especially to Abbas al-Aqad, the poet who was his mentor. But in general, this period was basically framed as a failure, and which was supposed to explain why Sayyid Qutb joined Islamism. Failure was framed in terms of his inability to adapt to effervescent Cairo modernity, or his inability to become a famous literati of the same scale as Taha Hussein, Abbas al-Aqad, and Tawfiq al-Hakim, and other famous writers. But for me, the thesis of his failure seemed questionable, because when you look at the press of the 40s and 50s, you constantly see the name of Sayyid Qutb as a literary critic and as a writer. And actually, he was in the 50s, he even achieved or arrived to the position of editorialist of Ar-Risala, one of the major, actually the major highbrow literary magazine at the time. And it's clearly because Abbas al-Aqad was writing editorial, so I think sometimes he was giving to Sayyid Qutb to write something too. And also Sayyid Qutb produced a very important book on literary criticism, which is quite influential in literary criticism until now, especially in his way to unite psychology and literary criticism. So the thesis of his failure was not really convincible for me. Another reason why I really didn't like this explanation, this thesis of literary failure and Islamist success, was that I had an impression that the thesis of Qutb's turn to Islamism from literature, which was usually understood as some big biographical break, reflected or bore traces of the modernist paradigm in reading Egypt's intellectual history, which was very common in the older scholarship on Nahda in the 70s and 80s, and which saw Egypt's intellectual history as being defined by a conflict between modernists or westernized intellectuals and traditionalists, those who opposed them. So, and I felt that this reading in terms of a rupture of Qutb's life reflected or was informed by this underlying paradigm, which saw literature as something modern, and then his transition to Islamism as some kind of deviation from modernity to tradition. And this reading of Egyptian history in terms of conflict between modernity and tradition has been really challenged already, but I have the impression it was not the case in literature, in literary studies or intellectual history. So, and also in certain biographies as that of Sayyid Qutb, it was informing in very much implicit way. So I felt that there was something that needs to be reworked. So my aim of the work was double. First, I wanted to reintegrate Sayyid Qutb in Egypt's interwar and early post-colonial history, from which he was expelled, and to adopt an inverse reading of his biography, not as a rupture between his literary past and Islamic later Islamic commitment, but as a continuity with a hypothesis that maybe something in literature, or like something that he assigned to literature, steered him in the direction of Islamism under particular conditions, which I would explore. So I had these two lines of investigation that I spent years in trying to combine. So for the first one, how to reintegrate Sayyid Qutb in Egypt's history, I used sociability approach by trying to look at Egypt's interwar intellectual life and intellectual production from the perspective of Nadwa culture, of Nadwa as a literary club, from the perspective of people's of intellectual exchange, in which Qutb was part, actually, of which Qutb was part. So this approach allowed me to find a place for him actually in literary history. The second goal, to reach the biography as a continuity, I adopted a textual approach because I still needed to make sense of his development of ideas. And there I used the notion of existential problem that was suggested by Bernard Larire. He's a sociologist of literature. In English, it doesn't sound good, but in French, it's problématique existentielle. So basically, it's something that that is a driving force, continuing driving force of writers that makes them write. It's some kind of anxiety of a nudging question that that provides a guiding line for his own intellectual project. So this concept allowed me to think of Qutb's whole intellectual project, his literary and Islamist texts together, as a continuity, as maybe reconfigured existential problem, reconfigures something. So these two actually, I combine these two approaches by thinking of intellectual practice, so sociability, and intellectual production texts. And while texts allowed to access his interiority, sociability approach allowed to identify his social networks or social groups of which he was part and with which he cooperated, which somehow allowed to, which guided him in, or directed him and shaped his existential problem, or directed it to different venues of expression and exploration, and gave it to a different shape. So I could see the change and continuity by using these two approaches. So I will expand briefly on each of them. So first, literature and network culture. I called network culture the culture of literary clubs, of literary gatherings, which can take place and takes place actually until now. I think in all contexts of intellectual production, it's an important part of intellectual life. People hanging out in cafes, in headquarters of journals, in bookstores, in literary salons, and I wanted to integrate this approach of sociability in understanding interwar literary culture. But of course, I was led to this idea by the data I could collect on Sayyid Qutb, because how can you integrate someone who has been expelled from literary history? So I had to look for unexpected or different sets of data which were maybe untouched by this efforts of Qutb's elimination. And what I found interesting, or what actually came out, what I noticed, were all the literature that is produced as a result of intellectual exchange. So it can be dedications, as here you can see in the picture, the dedication from Sayyid Qutb to Abbas al-Aqad, his mentor, which accompanied his book, Al-Atyaf al-Arba'a. It's one of the sources I use, dedications, then prefaces or introductions written by someone to someone, then collections of literary battles, collections of literary criticism, all the literature of tribute. Actually, it occupies a huge place in Egyptian literary production, on the literature written about the mentors, or all the literature that is called people I used to know, or people who taught me something. So I was very interested in this kind of corpus, and also lampoons, or books written to denounce someone, or books written to diffuse some rumors. Basically, books that are intended not for the readership, not for the public, but for other intellectuals. So in general, I found this idea of trying to rewrite the literary history of the interval from this perspective to be very, very fascinating. And also it allowed me to see and basically to complicate this binary reading of history as being defined by the conflict between westernized intellectuals and modernists and traditional intellectuals. Because when you look at the spaces of socialization and the circles, you see that actually some people who are defined as westernizers on the basis of their texts were usually part of the circles that were defined as traditional or reactionary. For example, I can mention two examples. Ismail Mazhar, the translator of Darwin, he is very often classified as westernizer because he translated Darwin, but actually he was part of the Salafiyya bookstore circle, which became famous by attacking Taha Hussein for his controversial book on the pre-Islamic poetry. Another example is Ahmed Zaki Abu Shabi, the founder of Apollo Association, which is also sometimes defined as the spokesperson of Western modernity in Egypt. But actually, he was part also of the Salafiyya bookstore circle, and he was positioning himself against the group of Taha Hussein. So I thought that this approach, sociability approach to literature, allowed us to see differently and to avoid this binary reading of literary and intellectual history, which is still very dominant. Using all this data, I don't want to expand on this data, but if you have questions later, you can ask me. But it's been very difficult to collect and to make lists and to see a little bit networks of Sayyid Qutb. Of course, it was very complicated. Of course, it was not exhaustive. Of course, it's fragmentary what we have. But basically, from all these networks, I could identify three circles, which I defined three worldly moments, defined each of them by a particular network of intellectuals and a particular place of socialization, a bookstore or a school, etc. So the first circle is the circle, Qutb circle of romantic poets that was formed in the mid-30s in the College of Dar al-Ulum, where Sayyid Qutb studied. I'm not sure if they were his classmates, but I think that they were, but I didn't find the proof. But anyway, they were forming a tightly knit group of friends. Each of them were, it was basically Sayyid Qutb's support group to experiment in literature. They would be reading each other's poems. They would be reading each other's non-published poems, manuscripts, which is, I think, very interesting nuance, how the group was working. They were exchanging non-published poems. They were also reviewing each other's works in the press, and they were writing to each other introductions and prefaces, and praising each other's works, etc. So we can really see that it was a group of friends, and it was composed from Sayyid Qutb and from poets Abdul Aziz Atiq and Faida Lamrusi. And later, when Apollo Society was formed, they all three went to Apollo Society. But then the group broke up when Apollo Society got into a conflict with Abbas al-Aqad, and Sayyid Qutb had to choose between his mentor and between his peers. So he chose his mentors, and his friendship with Atiq suffered. But with Faida Lamrusi, it came back later, in a later period. So it was the first circle in which Sayyid Qutb was introduced to romantic poetry. The second worldly moment was shaped by the rise of anti-colonial activism following World War II and the accompanying criticism of the interwar colonial culture. So this moment consisted of constellation of ideologically fluid groups involved in different strats of activism against the monarchy and the colonial culture of Taha Hussein and all the Udaba generation. And the most famous of them, or the one that I had the most information, was the Publishing Committee of University Graduates, founded in '42 in Maktaba Masr, in the Masr Library, Masr Publishing House. And this is where Sayyid Qutb met Naguib Mahfouz, because we know there is this information circulating that Sayyid Qutb was reviewing the work of Naguib Mahfouz, and Naguib Mahfouz actually was reviewing the work of Sayyid Qutb, but we don't know how this happened and how did they know each other, etc. So Sayyid Qutb was going to this, was part actually of this committee. He published there his first edition of Social Justice of Islam. So this also shows how the boundaries between Islamism and non-Islamism or literature were blurred at that point. Also, it's the time when Sayyid Qutb reached enough of fame, and he had his position in Ar-Risala, so he could use actually of his symbolic capital to promote the members of the publishing committee who were much younger than him, and he had enough symbolic capital to create his own journals, to assume the editorship of his own journals, such as Al-Alam Al-Arabi, founded in 1947, and Al-Fikr Al-Jadid, founded in 1948. And in these journals, he brought his network, and he was mentoring them. And we have a lot of information that he was actually promoting these intellectuals who were much younger than him by looking for publishers for them, writing introduction to their works, reviewing their works. When no one actually cares about them, he was doing this, but because he was actually part of the group as an older intellectual and who had more influence. The third moment is his membership in the Muslim Brotherhood. And yeah, his integration to the Muslim Brotherhood had several stages, and actually it's through the publishing committee of university graduates that he met the Muslim Brotherhood. So again, we see how the boundaries were blurred. And just to say a couple of words, that an important part that is always that's not really taken into consideration is this the period of repression and incarceration with the Muslim brothers, how it actually affected Sayyid Qutb's production. He started to write at that point poetry that was very much Muslim brother poetry, that you would start with Akhi, my brother, that the poetry that celebrated the values of brotherhood and loyalty, etc. So it was a direct influence of this brotherhood socialization. So while his circles of sociability were shifting, his intellectual project remained essentially the same. Qutb, in his different in the different fields of knowledge in which he wrote something, he was driven by a particular anxiety about the finitude of human's life. This is what they called existential problem, using Lahir's concept. This anxiety cuts across his different projects: poetry, romantic poetry, theory of aesthetics, psychoanalysis, because he was very interested in that, and finally his Islamist texts. In all these texts, there is an attempt to locate the unknown, or the magical, or or metaphysical, which was very much allocated, the unknown, unseen, obscure. In all his writings, he's driven by this curiosity about the obscure, al-ghaib, and its connection to the physical life that we have. So let me briefly tell, I think I don't have a lot of time, so I will just briefly introduce, show how in each of these different fields of knowledge this quest for metaphysical was expressed. Poetry for Qutb was more than the production of texts or poems. For him, poetry provided really the understanding of existence. And as poetry was redefined with the modern age as romantic poetry, and Shi'r al-Wujdan, the poetry of affect, emotion, of interior, for Qutb, poetry was the manifestation of this ghaib and metaphysical. And poets, for him, were as prophets who were blessed with the right to connect. Actually, he uses this very much, haqq al-ittisal, the right to connect to the other world. He wrote a lot of poetry that I studied a little bit in my book, in which he expressed his longing to join that other world, or the other shore. His first diwan is named Ashat al-Maghul, the unknown shore. And Ashat al-Maghul, it's this other reality there, that with different temporality, where the distinction between humans does not exist. So he tried to define, to conceptualize this metaphysical sphere by the feeling. Later in his literary criticism, he conceptualized the process of poetic creation as being powered by the affective logic, the sphere of imagination and emotion located with the human brain, through which the metaphysical or ghaib communicated with human soul. And he opposed it to al-mantiq al-dhihni, the rational sphere, which for him was responsible for daily affairs, for politics, for ruling, for basically satisfying the material needs of human beings. So for him, he had always this separation between spiritual and physical. In the mid-40s, Qutb started to work on the Quran, and he wrote two works on aesthetics, in which he joined the poetic inspiration and the divine inspiration, in which he joined the ghaib in the poetical sense with the divine, and which would lead him to Islamism. In other sciences, he also was looking for this ghaib. Psychoanalysis, he was very interested in that. He was saying that, yeah, even there is something Allah shu'ur, the subconsciousness, and this is where this is how psychoanalysis speaks about this sphere that he was trying to access in poetry. In later political writings, Qutb completed the association between metaphysical and the divine, and transferred the criteria of validity of knowledge from the poet's anteriority to the Quran. But even in his late Islamist writings, the importance of the emotion and metaphysics as the link to the metaphysical and al-ghaib was preserved, because he was saying that genuine Islam can be accessed only through praxis, through action, which activated emotional engagement with religion, and at the same time activated very strong powers within humans that laid beyond the rational willpower. So it was for me the continuing Qutb's interest, which led him from poetry to Islam. Okay, so now I think I need to conclude. I'm not sure how much time I have.
You have circa 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Okay. So so what does Sayyid Qutb says about some bigger questions about Egypt's early and modern and early post-colonial history? First of all, it says something interesting about the condition of modernity in early decades of the 20th century. The origins of Qutb's metaphysical anxiety could be traced to the effect of modernity in rationalizing the world, the introduction of new sciences, the reform of religion in the sense of its rationalization, contributed to narrow down of the reality to its sole dimension accessible to human reason. And this led to the prevention of unseen al-ghaib from the scope of the world. Interestingly, poetry escaped this. Poetry, on the contrary, was re-enchanted, because poetry from modern time was something very social, It was more like social occasions, and with the influence of Romanticism, it became a space of enchantment and magic. So the poetry was the only space at the time that was where the metaphysical could be experienced, or the magic could be experienced. So this explains why Qutb was interested in this art. The colonial moment, which started after the Second World War, delegitimized poetry as a luxurious activity and as the activity of ivory tower intellectuals. So this space disappeared because literature was redefined as along the lines of commitment. Literature had to serve a goal of material world, to improve social justice. And I consider that this moment is crucial in understanding why Qutb chose or went to Islamism, because Islamism not only provided the space to connect with the metaphysical, but also it provided the model for social change and social action and social justice. So basically it allowed to create a synthesis of all these contradicting desires of the post-colonial age. Then, of course, Islamist project, we all know, failed because Islamism was erased from the political scene since the mid-50s. And it's not a coincidence that at the same time, when Islam started to be pushed away and Islamists put in prison, Sayyid Qutb and Muhammad Qutb, his brother, started to think about Islamist poetry, Al-Adab al-Islami. They created this project, or they tried to create. And for me, it was the last attempt to re-enchant the disenchanted post-colonial age, which also failed because Islamist poetry became something very limited and trying only to promote clean culture. So its aims were very much reduced. Yeah, so maybe I will tell just one sentence why it's so. Maybe I will just, I will try to connect with my contemporary project on literature in Egypt, because it would seem really very different. And for me, it seems very different project, but at the end, I realized that it was very much about the same. It was about the literature as a space of this, we can define as elsewhere, or the space that of anti-structure that people could create in order to escape their dull lives and experience themselves differently, experience their identities different. So now in my project about Egyptian writers and the writing today in Egypt, but I focus mostly on unknown writers, I'm trying to understand literature as this space of magic in people's life. So I will stop now, and if you have more questions, I'm ready and very happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Giedrė. Perfectly on time. Thank you. I mean, for me, this was mind-blowing to think about Sayyid Qutb in the framework of Egyptian literary history. That's, I mean, it completely changed my perspective now. Because as you were saying, I'm trained to think in terms of two separate words, two separate life words, if you want. And I mean, we hear a little bit about the disappearance of Al-Adab al-Islami in the 50s and after, but it's like such a minor, it's maybe 2 pages in books of literary history. So to follow this pattern, it really changed perspective. And also I see this framework of sociability, of studying literature in terms of sociability as particularly apt to the Egyptian literary field and maybe beyond also. So I'm thinking it's really fascinating what you share with us today. Thank you. My first question, if I may, before I also open the floor for questions, is what happens to Qutb's books afterwards. Like you mentioned, for example, is influential study of criticism. Was it an Naqd al-Adabi that you had, or his writings about literature? Are there republications of these books, or have they also been completely erased from the literary market?
And thank you also for good complimenting. It's very nice to know that you liked it. Concerning the republication of books, so most of the books of Qutb were republished by Shuruk Publishing House, which acquired the publishing rights I think in the 80s. And it was okay, especially Islamist books were published until early 2000s without any restrictions. Actually, there were a lot of editions coming out, but literary works were excluded because, and this we don't know, but Muhammad Qutb, his brother, who was a translator of Qutb, like in many sense, or his popularizer in the world, he is saying that Sayyid Qutb asked him not to publish his poetry books or his literary books. So we are not sure if Sayyid Qutb did that or not, but we know that Muhammad Qutb made a lot of rereading and readaptations of Sayyid Qutb's work because Muhammad Qutb lived in Saudi Arabia and he had to make his brother's work compatible with the conservative Saudi establishment. So he had to erase a lot of references to revolution, a lot of references to the notion that he used Wahdat al-Wujud, the Sufi notion, because it was associated to Sufism. So he had to do all this work. So part of this work was to basically put all his poetry under the rug. So some books, actually, the Egyptian Revolution provided some opening for publication of some of his books. It's a very interesting moment. I hope someone will study it someday. But Al-Ahram Publishing House published the collection of poetry, Sayyid Qutb, for the first time in 2014. And the General Book Authority, Al-Hay'a Al-Amal Al-Kitab in Cairo, published his first novel, Al-Ashwaq, in 2011. So there was an opening allowed, even in governmental institutions, by the revolutionary moment. So his books were, some of his books, but we still don't have the publication of other Gothic novels by Qutb. We can find them online, but they don't, there is no publishing house. It's not really citable. It's some kind of pirated documents. Yeah.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting. I invite the public now to raise your hand if you have questions. I already see one hand raised up. Hanada Karma, please feel free to ask your question.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. And I have actually two questions, and I try to be short because I'm not feeling very well. Thank you for doing this with the title Demonization, because I was wondering, it made me curious to come and listen. But I'm still wondering, what is the demonization factor? The Sayyid Qutb himself and the Islamists who are propagating his books are not reprinting the literary work, his literary work. So it's not only the state that is not doing it. Luckily for me and for, let's say, Arab readers, we don't have copyrights. So every book that you want, including Dilal al-Quran and Fi Dilal al-Quran, his interpretation, it's online and you can get it for nothing, few minutes of download. So the ban on books and the ban on publication shifts and varies according to the political state, but the availability of the books do not change according to that. It's online, you can get whoever you want to, including Faraj Fuda. That's on the one hand. The Islamists have done this tradition, I would say, of omitting Al-Ghazali's book on logic, omitting Ibn Hazm's Tawq al-Hamama in favor of a more, if you want, what we know now as Islamist thinking. The second thing is that it's himself who has started writing things like The Milestone to put a political project. So he, as an author, contributed in putting his political books, in his interpretation of how Islamic society should be on the table. It's not that I, as a reader, was not shown his literary work. So how do you reconcile this demonization with the acts of Sayyid Qutb himself? And a footnote question, did you read about his journey to the US and what he viewed there? Because, you know, part of what he writes there is not if not demonizing the West, I don't know what is. And thank you for listening to my questions.
Thank you for your questions. Yeah, I completely agree that Islamists also not. It's in the interest not to show Sayyid Qutb as a man of literature. So, but this is what I was trying to explain by using this concept of schismogenesis, that it's both sides that do this work. It's not one side. It's not only the state that would strip Sayyid Qutb from his literary identity. It's also his camp, or the camp that wants to adopt him. Also, they use the same. And Muhammad Qutb's efforts in preventing his literary works to be published, it's very much it's showing this very much. And of course, we can get Sayyid Qutb's literary works very easily, but it's not about the availability. In fact, actually, I was speaking about. Of course, it's available, but the way of seeing Sayyid Qutb, the way of studying him, the way of treating his literary past. I was speaking more in these terms. I don't know. I was thinking a lot with. Was trying to have the analogy with Céline, the French writer. You know, who was quite discredited because he supported the Nazism in France, but this did not lead him to stop being a writer or being part of the literary history of France. So it's not really. I mean, it's not. There is something particular about Sayyid Qutb, and I think that the usage of his image as the tool to discredit the Brotherhood, or to remind the bloodshed and that took place, contributes in his shaping his image, and prevents us to understand him also as someone who might have been led to Islam by his literary projects, because also the part of this schismogenetic discourse is to see all Egyptian history as being defined by the conflict between secularism and Islamism, and dividing also intellectual production, people according to this line of divide, which is seen to be a force that governs the Egyptian history. I'm not sure if I replied to this question, but I wanted to. I used the word demonization, but I was thinking more in terms of schismogenesis, which creates this condition of societies very polarized, and also tries to locate these polarizations deep down into history by reconsidering history. And we know that a lot of intellectuals were pressured to renounce Sayyid Qutb, to delete, to drop his name, to drop his poems. So there was something non-accidental about this. Responding to your other question, yeah, I read his works on the United States, and yeah, he is demonizing also. I mean, he was also demonized. Actually, he was demonizing Nasser also. So both sides were demonizing each other at this point. And I see it as part of this totalizing ambitions the Islamist movement and secular Nasserist movement had for post-colonial projects, which was very much invested with a lot of emotions and also the right of the state to investigate humans' interiority. Both of them actually had very, very similar projects about how post-colonial Egyptian state should look like. So both of them were very similar in how they imagined the role of the state there, the role of individual, but what differed was basically the fundamentals on which the state will stand. Is it Islam or some kind of Arab nationalism? So I think that they are very similar.
Thank you, Giedrė. So I see Brynjar earlier has his hands raised up. Please, Brynjar.
Yes, thank you for an interesting talk. Look forward to reading the book. As far as I know, Sayyid Qutb wrote a work entitled something like "The Task of the Poet in Life and Poetry in the Contemporary Generation." I think it was one of his first works, but could you say something more about what was his perception regarding the role of the intellectual, including himself in cultural and political life? And do you think that role, in a sense, was passed on to his perception of the vanguard in his thought on in his writings in Ma'alim fi Tariq, for example, where the role of the vanguard is obviously important?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question, actually. Of course, for him, it was intellectuals had a central role, but it's interesting to see how it shifted in these different moments, which I try to define by different his worldly moments. So in this book that you cited, he's speaking very much about a poet really as a prophet who has a higher degree of sensitivity than the ordinary humans, and who can access to knowledge about the existence, to access to knowledge about the and how it interacts to the basically the zones of intersection between metaphysical and physical. This was his mission that he assigned to himself, of course. So it was very much the question of knowing the existence, understanding the world that intellectual had to fulfill. Then in the decolonial moment after the World War II, this role of knowledge somehow lost its urgency, because intellectuals had to act. They had to act. They had to change the world. It was a new conception of intellectual work as a committed intellectuals. And actually, there was a very big campaign against the Udaba generation about Tawfiq al-Hakim as an ivory tower intellectuals who were just detached from the suffering of the people and were just trying to understand the world. So Sayyid Qutb, he redefined he basically converted into this committed intellectual at that time, who said we needed to act by writing in the press. This is why he started to write in the press, angry articles at that moment. Before that, he wasn't writing so much about politics, he was writing poetry. But at that point, the place where politics was done shifted. It was the war and Suez War. It was the demonstrations, sit-ins, angry articles in the press. So he imagined himself as at that point as committed intellectual. Then the vanguard, yeah, I think it's the third moment. A third. I didn't think about it much in my book, actually, because I always thought that vanguard, whom he imagined as vanguard, was this organization of 65. They called 65 Tanzim of 65, 1965, which was composed by some people who were close, not all of them were close to the Muslim Brotherhood, and we really don't know much about this organization, but Sayyid Qutb, I think he saw in them this role of reestablishing the Islamic society, understanding Islam correctly, and acting and acting for a change, which was also very close to the second moment of a committed intellectual. It's just that he assigned this to someone else. He was conceiving himself better as some kind of guide, spiritual guide, and these people, the vanguard, they were young, active, curious Muslim brothers.
Thank you, Giedrė. So I see Hanada as another question. Maybe I could ask one in between, Hanada. So I was thinking also in terms of, when you were talking about shifting between different social circles and different lifestyles, I was thinking also if, thinking about youth could lead you also somewhere. I'm thinking also of, like being, I mean, many of these writers at that time, they were young. They were, they were young at their age. So whether you could see, this more in terms of youth behaviors, right? In terms studying Qutb's life. And then I wonder if you could also elaborate more about, the act of collecting this type of sources that you were mentioning, book dedications, letters. I mean, how do you collect it? Where did you start? How did you go about it?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, the first question about the youth. I think it's an important thing to consider, because when I was also trying to add the level of analysis in my book about mentorship and discipleship relationship that which is some form of sociability between intellectuals, which is very important in Egypt literature and intellectual culture up to now, as many of you might know. So I was trying to conceptualize this. And in the 40s, Sayyid Qutb was playing a part of mentor for the younger intellectuals. He was promoting them. He actually was kind of using them against his battle with the older generation, with the generation of his own mentors, like Abbas al-Akkad, because they were discredited as ivory tower, or Abbas al-Akkad was very anti-communist, so he was seen as very reactionary, etc. So and he continued this kind of role of mentorship later when he came in prison, and when he went out from prison, because we know that he was having a salon in his house in Halwan every Friday, where we don't know who really went there, but we know that some people from Tanzim 65 were going there, but also all intellectuals from other countries of Islamic bent, from Syria, from Saudi Arabia, when they were passing through Cairo, they would go to Sayyid Qutb's salon. So yeah, I think the question of youth is youth and the question of age and the position in the relation is very important. To your second question, yeah, it was actually I started collecting the data very intuitively. I never had a method more that would be more systematic. So I think everything started. It wasn't my research in the beginning. I wasn't thinking about Sayyid Qutb particularly. I just wanted to do history of sociability at that point, and I was doing lists of all contributors of different journals and seeing who connects with whom. And then I could see that there were shillas or some kind of like circles. And for Sayyid Qutb, I had some lists of his published articles, and I made my own lists. I tried to collect his articles and also see in which journals he was publishing. Then seeing who was the editor of that journal, and then seeing what he published and what he wrote. And sometimes I could find that, oh, this person was speaking about Sayyid Qutb actually at some point. So I basically was tracing other intellectuals, and I really discovered a lot of unknown people, unknown intellectuals who published 1 or 2 books ever in the 40s, and they were in Sayyid Qutb's circle, and they are not known today, but their books exist, and they were part of Sayyid Qutb's circle. So it also allowed me to bring into life some unknown people who were not famous. And another very interesting, very good, very productive method was to get all the editions of his books with all the publishing houses and to see how it shifted. Like, for example, I discovered that the publishing committee for university graduates published 3 books of Sayyid Qutb. So it already allowed me to see that he was somehow connected to the circle. And then I followed the writings of the members, and then I interviewed some, and it was confirmed. I got more and more information about this Sayyid Qutb's role in this circle. And it also showed me how Sayyid Qutb gradually became integrated in Muslim Brotherhood's media infrastructure, how he started to write in their journals, how he started to publish in their publishing houses. So basically, it allowed me to see the transition also in this, like through different circles.
Thank you, Giedrė. And I guess this is connected to Hanada's next question, right? About the groups who have accepted him. Hanada, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. I'm sorry if I taking someone else's time, but I would like to know, and if you can elaborate on which groups have been, as an Islamist thinker, have been affected by him, because I've come across some groups within the Islamic Brotherhood variations that do not like him at all, and some are criticizing him for parts of interpretation, some verses in the Quran, and some commentary on the Sahaba, while others view his views on the Mujtama al-Jahili and the need for organizing the Islamic society as a must and as the map to go. So if you came across these differences, I would love it if you can tell us a little bit more about it. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's another research project. It's very interesting, the reception of Sayyid Qutb. I don't know much. I just know that he was attacked by a Salafi trend because he criticized some Sahaba. He never liked Osman, for example, and even he was attacked by the editor, famous editor, what's his name? Shakir, Mahmoud Muhammad Shakir, for that, for attacking, for criticizing Sahaba. So also the notion of Wahdat al-Wujud, influences of Sufism, which actually influences of poetry in his Islamist writings, were not accepted by many groups of Salafi trends. So yeah, his reception is clearly controversial, but more than this I can't really say, because I think it's a very huge topic.
Thank you, Giedrė. More questions? Feedback? No, okay. If not, I would just like to thank all of you for joining us, and I would like to thank you, especially Giedrė, for accepting our invitation and delivering this very fascinating lecture. So we are looking forward to read the book. I think it will be of interest to many of us here. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a nice weekend. So before I would just like to remind you that next seminar is on the 14th of May, and we'll have Raphael Cormac presenting his book on Egyptian divas in the 1920s. So midnight in Kairos in the 20s. So we keep with Egypt, but we shift to a completely different kind of cultural production. So see you on the 14th of May. Thank you, everyone. Bye.